Much, Minister, for your powerful words about commitment to making workplaces and the home and the streets safe for everyone, particularly women, and especially those from marginalised communities who we know are at greater risk. I also love the words about we stand on the shoulders of those who've gone before us, and we do stand on the shoulders of giants. I see a lot of second-wave feminists in the room today, and I'd like to thank you for your powerful work, because we would not be here today without that incredible, incredible sacrifice. Our next speaker really needs no introduction, but I'm going to give her one anyway. She is an extraordinary human being. She's been involved in a number of projects over the years as convener of the Male Champions of Change, of course, started by the brilliant Elizabeth Broderick, and now she's leading the National Inquiry into Sexual Harassment in Australian Workplaces. Would you please welcome the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins.
Well, thank you very much, and I have 15 minutes to talk to you about what I've been doing for the last 12 months, so I will be as efficient but also as direct as possible. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. That was, as happens in Victoria, a fantastic welcome, and I absolutely feel welcomed, and I also completely support that view that this is Aboriginal lands, always has been, always will be. I was going to also go through the acknowledgements of all the, particularly the leaders in the room, but I think the Minister did such a fantastic job. I just want to say what she said, and in particular just point out that if you look at this overhead of the organisations and the leaders in this state, I can absolutely start by saying that as someone who is a Victorian but has taken on a national role, that Victoria is on the issues of gender equality and a range of other issues, absolutely positively leading the country and recognised across the country as that. So as the work you do happens and you think about how it impacts your workplace, even your department, I can assure you that lots of people want to know what you're doing, whether it's working, what your evaluations are telling you. There's lots of places across this country that don't have the privilege to live in a state that prioritises gender equality to this degree, but there's also a lot of people across the country who absolutely want to achieve that, and it is a fantastic thing that we have a state here where there's a preparedness to take some risks and try some things to move the dial. I also then on that like to thank you all for being here on a Monday morning to get a room full of these people with a list of some of the most forward-thinking speakers that will follow me. How fantastic for you, but also it is an investment in you. So let me tell you, I've been talking about sexual harassment, as I said, for a good 18 months now. In fact, I've been working in sexual harassment since I started my career as an employment lawyer in 1993. So I have seen the issue of sexual harassment from multiple angles, and there is no question over time I have realised that notwithstanding people saying that sexual harassment is not welcomed and is not tolerated, that the experience of sexual harassment continues at alarming rates. Over the last year, I have been talking to people across the country, and I think of one young woman I spoke to in one of the consultations in Victoria. She was a young migrant woman from Cambodia, had come to Australia in the hope of a better life. She got here and she was absolutely delighted to get a job working in rural Victoria, fruit picking, because it not only gave her a minimum wage, it also gave her accommodation. But when she was at her accommodation, she was molested on multiple occasions by a cash contractor who was also working at the same farm that she was working at. And because of language barriers and because of a lack of understanding of the laws here, and also because of the fact that she was on a visa and needed to be working, she did not realise that the conduct was unlawful. And it wasn't until she met a union representative who was working across the farms that she realised what she happened was unlawful, and also that there were avenues that she could act. I also spoke to another woman in Brisbane, and she is a company director. She's on a number of boards, including listed boards. Her career is a portfolio of boards. And I was talking to her because one of the boards she's on is an organisation that's had a number of issues of sexual harassment, and I was interested in, from a board perspective, you know, how did you deal with this? And in the course of that, and when she asked me to put my pen down, she said, "Can I just tell you something that happened not that long ago to me?" She described that she had been on a board. It was the board that paid her the most. And she had been talking to the chair on some day. She was in his office, and she said, "I was upset about something work-related." And he came over to me and he took my face between his hands and he said, "I love you." And she sort of said, she was suddenly really very concerned. She tried to get away. She sort of got up and went to the washroom. So it obviously is in one of those offices that has a washroom, which I didn't know they still exist, but she said it does. And he followed her into there, and she felt very scared. Shortly after that, there was a dinner. She was sitting next to him, and he again leaned across and said, "I love you." What she said is that she was so uncomfortable. 2 weeks later, she resigned from that board. She said it was just not workable for me to continue to be on the board with this person. She said I would not have complained, although I did write a statement because I don't know what's going to happen in the future, so she wrote it for herself. But she said she just couldn't work with him. But what she said is that was a few years ago, it being 2 or 3, she said, when I came off that board, the media criticised me for leaving the board for no reason, not giving a reason. And she said only now, and she's just been appointed to a particular role in the board, only now have I got back to the same income that I was earning 3 years ago when I came off that board. The point about those stories isn't to say, don't you feel sorry for privileged women? It's to point out that as I go across the country, those stories, no matter what industry, no matter what level, and no matter what part of Victoria, I'm hearing those stories, and they have some of the same hallmarks every time. So the national inquiry was really prompted out of this national and global conversation we're having about sexual harassment at the moment. And Tracy's very modest, but last week in Sydney, the Sydney Peace Prize was awarded to the Me Too movement, and Tracy and Tarana Burke together are accepting on behalf of the huge momentum towards sexual harassment. So the National Inquiry came about because whilst the Human Rights Commission has been doing surveys on the prevalence of sexual harassment that have told us that sexual harassment is a high experience, no one really has had the will or commitment to really focus on what needs to be changed. For 35 years, we've had laws under the Sex Discrimination Act, and yet the change hasn't happened. It's been a set and forget kind of system. And so this was a chance to use the unique powers of the Australian Human Rights Commission to look at what is clearly a national concern. And the interesting thing about it is that we talk about this in Australia, and I say Victoria's leading Australia. Well, I would say Australia in some ways is leading the world. As part of my role every March, I get the privilege of going to New York to the United Nations for the international conference on women called the Commission on the Status of Women. And the last 2 years, but particularly this year when I've gone, I've led sessions on the National Inquiry and sexual harassment. there is a global movement towards changing this. There's a group of more than 40 countries that have come together with a focus on prevention of sexual harassment. The United Nations is putting together all the resources it can, but plus looking at its own backyard to consider how it combats sexual harassment. The International Labour Organisation is proposing a new international convention on violence and harassment in the world of work. So there's huge momentum. So what's happening here and what can we learn? I thought I would give you an overview of some of the data that we have and then just raise with you about 4 themes just quite quickly to give you fodder for your panel discussion. So the data tells us, and most of you will know, the surveys that we did last year told us that 1 in 3 Australian workers have experienced sexual harassment. That includes 39% of women and 26% of men, and the people most at risk are in fact young people. It told us that majority of harassers were men, 4 out of 5. It told us that only 17% of people who experience sexual harassment are prepared to raise a complaint, and of those, half of them say nothing changed as a result. It also told us that although more people are noticing sexual harassment, 2/3 of bystanders who observe or witness harassment do nothing as a result. So talking, as part of the inquiry, what we're doing is we're using the survey results, which Australia does better really than anyone, gathering the data, and many of you do that work on a daily basis. We've also held consultations in every major city and 4 different regional centres. We've been open for submissions till the end of February, and we've received submissions, about 450 submissions. A number of them are from organisations on the views, including a number of organisations in this room, plus individual submissions. And so what have I heard? If I just pick, there's so much I could talk to you about, but if I pick sort of 4 key themes that have occurred to me, the first thing I've already alluded to, which is sexual harassment happens in this country no matter what location, no matter what level, and no matter what industry. Our survey told us about industry data, so we do know, and I've heard the stories, that some industries are worse than others. So we can now confirm that the stats in media and arts and entertainment are higher rates of sexual harassment. We know women in male-dominated industries like mining and construction experience much higher rates of sexual harassment. We know people who are in customer-facing roles experience high rates of sexual harassment. But those stats also point out that actually people in your workplace are experiencing sexual harassment. We know particularly too that particular cohorts are at higher risk, and I guess I'll flag particularly migrant workers, particularly people in the LGBTI community, particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers, and particularly women, people with disabilities, but particularly women with disabilities. And we also have seen that one of the reasons why there actually in our research suggests there's been an increase in sexual harassment is the insecure and changing nature of work. That I often use the media industry as an example to explain that actually lots of other industries are heading this way. This is an industry that's quite small, that's highly competitive, people really want to get into it, that's run particularly by a few people but generally men in powerful positions, and that is the classic insecure employment, run on project basis that you can, even if you're a makeup artist, a camera operator or a newsreader, that you get your contract for a limited time and you hope to continue to get those contracts. So then I go to the next point that I'll point out, which is how are the laws working for people who experience sexual harassment? Absolutely, without doubt, you will hear when we release our report at the end of this year that the laws currently are only enforced through the bravery and courage of victims to either speak up in their workplace or to bring a legal claim. And the reality is there is no real obligation on employers to do anything. Now, I'll come to that when I talk about employers, but in practice, what have we heard? We've heard, for all of those reasons that I've said already, no one wants to complain about sexual harassment. They don't want to complain because it puts their reputation at risk, it puts their career at risk, it often results in them not being believed, invalidated, they have to leave their employment, it affects their family and friends. What I've heard is they just don't want it to happen. And that sounds pretty obvious, but the systems currently in place offer a 0 to atomic. You either don't say anything or you bring a claim that becomes quite a complex investigation. And the options in the middle, where you could just somehow get feedback to that person on a daily, regular basis, they just don't exist. In terms of employers, what we've heard is, and what I'm really convinced of, is that actually there are a lot of incentives in our social, media and legal environment to conceal sexual harassment, but there's very few to prevent it. So the current media spotlight on this issue actually is driving even more panic amongst employers who will say, I'm concerned about sexual harassment, I want people to speak up, but actually know that if that happens and their organisation is on the front page of the paper, it will affect their customers, it will affect their recruitment of staff, and it will affect their share price. So my work is looking at how can we change the incentives, how can we make prevention the aim, how can we make sure that leaders don't get off the hook because they have a policy, but instead they're able to show that they have it implemented. And the last observation I'll make in terms of what I've heard across the country, which is what this conference is about, is that the most consistent key driver on sexual harassment is gender inequality. It is the fact of disrespect of women in the workplace, and also concepts of men, masculinity, heterosexuality, and a whole range of issues about how we as a society are advancing the gender equality conversation. So that lets me finish this talk by saying that even if you in your piece of work are not looking specifically at sexual harassment, anything you are doing towards advancing gender equality will be a critical driver to reducing sexual harassment and ensuring women and men are able to be safe at work, productive at work. So I thank you for that. I also acknowledge that many of you both are working on this issue but will have experienced sexual harassment. I acknowledge the toll that will have had on you in small or big ways and the way it's affected your careers. And I'm really motivated to try and make that change. So thank you very much.